I'm the Library Assistant Repository Support at AU Library and Scholarly Resources. In the chat, I did put a link to the presentation slides in the handout. I'll send it one more time. There is a lot of notes in the presentation slides, but I did put them in the GitHub link. So if I don't go through all the details, they're still available online through the GitHub link. All right. So the agenda for today, we will discuss an introduction of what research data management is and the relationship it has with research culture and the best practices for conducting research. And then moving on from there, we'll discuss the emerging requirements for RDM and the funding and publishing landscape. I will also go over some RDM considerations for creating a data management plan before moving into creating a data management plan with a tool called DMP Assistant. And this is a platform maintained by the Digital Research Alliance of Canada. And if time permitting, we can do a live demo of the DMP Assistant tool. So altogether, this presentation is intended to provide the beginnings of an RDM best practice toolkit that can be applied to different projects. And then throughout the slides of this presentation, you'll see some slides titled as tools and takeaways. And these just contain links to resources and templates and tools you can use. And again, they are available through that GitHub link. Deanna has also sent that through email as well. And yeah, just feel free to post questions in the chat or save them at the end of the presentation so that we don't, so we can cut them off before, because we will be posting this recording online and we will leave them out when we post the recording. Okay, so this is a little activity intended as a warm-up to get you thinking about your research and the tools and concepts that I present later in this presentation, how they might be useful for you. So I'll just give everyone kind of a minute or two to share your research context. If you have a project or thesis you're working on in the chat box, and what kind of methodologies have you decided? What kind of tools you're thinking of using to carry out your research? I'll just give you a minute or two. Okay, so I see some responses in the chat, so thank you for that. Someone mentioned they're doing biochemistry and they'll be using a lot of digital data. And I'm thinking the Alliance might be a good resource if you're working with like big data. They have what are called their high computing cluster platform. Let me see if I can find. Yes, they have advanced research computing, but you would need to have a supervisor to sponsor you on that project, but I can send the link there if you're interested in advanced research computing and their high performancing clusters. Someone mentioned OneDrive, Teams, Covidence for data management, and DMP Assistant. And mathematical computations of machine learning. Wow, mostly algebra. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. That's great. Thank you for sharing that. Oh, and thank you for sharing your research topic too. It's very interesting. Okay, so let's continue on. Okay, so we'll get started with the first topic in the agenda, research data management. So research data management, I'll go over the definition here. It's a general tool how you carry and plan and handle your data for a research project, starting from the planning stages through data gathering, generation, active analysis, and data deposit or long-term storage as a project is completed. Data management also includes additional things like storing and backing up your data, long-term preservation of data, reuse and sharing of the data. Also very important, any ethical implications about how the data is handled, preserved, or shared, and etc. Okay, so this is the research data lifecycle, and these are some of the data-related research activities that you will engage in throughout your research. And when we start with the plan, the initial plan of your data, we want to be thinking about things such as funding applications and the research proposal as you're putting together your data management plan. And when we're collecting your data, this particular plan can guide how you collect and document your data while you're actively using your data. And where you store in your data is important, as I mentioned before, and also having backups of your data to avoid data loss is important. It's also important for you to be compliant with any other relevant ethical and legal requirements, which we'll talk more into detail. So for example, if you're working with human participant data with identifiers that must be kept confidential or removed from the data, or if you're working with proprietary data. So yeah, we will go through this data management plan in more detail with the DMP assistant if time permits. And this is a screenshot of the AU's AU's Section 5 of the ethics application, which is around how you will store, retain, and dispose your data. So after the project is completed, you'll need to think about how the data is stored and preserved. And if you want to or required to share your data, you should plan this from the get-go because it's easier to share and reuse well-documented data at the beginning. Okay, onwards. So RDM as a part of research culture. So good research data management is a part of doing rigorous research and contributes to a vibrant research culture. So if you're doing a project, you'll be doing some research data management anyways, and these are some research data management. This is where research data management supports these 5 points on this slide. So RDM supports open scholarship movements. So by documenting processes and making them more transparent so that data can be shared and reused. This is also in keeping with open access and open research movements motivated by the desire to make publicly funded research publicly accessible. And by preserving data and making it accessible for reuse when possible is also a way of recognizing the funds and the efforts involved in data collection and generation. And if you set your terms and conditions to allow other researchers to use your data as a secondary data, then the value of your research grows exponentially, because you're allowing researchers to reuse your data in their projects, so the initial value of your data goes beyond your initial research. Okay, so next we're going to talk about best practices in RDM, and there's a couple of principles we'll go in detail. Okay, so these are the Go Fair initiative principles, and it promotes research data management best practices. So when you're planning and carrying out your research data management, you want to consider how to make your data fair. So the first principle is findable, and it's helping others find your data. So the data should be easy to find for both humans and computers, and they should be described and have sufficient metadata and persistent identifiers. Accessible. So once that user finds your data, they need to know how they can access it. This could be through authentication or authorization. Also, if you deposit your data in a trusted repository, it makes your data more accessible to researchers, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Interoperability is, so usually data needs to be integrated with other data, so it needs to be interoperable with other applications and workflows for analysis, storage, and processing, as we saw in that data lifecycle diagram. And lastly, reusable. This would, I would say, be the ultimate goal for FAIR, is to make the data reusable. And to achieve this goal, the metadata and the data should be well described so that they can be replicated and are combined in different settings. So the usage permissions and provenance should be clear. FAIR is considered as a continuum. So data can be more or less fair. So not all data can be 100% open and accessible and freely aligned. That's not necessarily appropriate in all contexts. There may be a statement about the data used in a particular project, who to contact to gain access to the data, and under what conditions the data can or cannot be made available. Sometimes the FAIR principles tend to focus more on machine actionability of data, so that the data is described in a way people can access it and work with it in computing environments, and that may be more or less relevant to your project, depending on what type of data you're collecting and how you're processing it, and what makes sense in your own research area. Okay, so the next principles is the CARE and OCAP principles. These are particularly important if you're working with Indigenous communities or data about Indigenous peoples, and these support Indigenous data sovereignty. So the CARE principles here were drafted by an international group called the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, and they can be used to guide your planning, but you still always want to work with your particular community partners, or do things appropriate to context. OCAP here is a Canadian specific principle developed specifically for First Nations in Canada, and it was put forward by the First Nations Information Governance Center, and they provide their own training they offer on applying the OCAP principles. So I will just briefly go over each of these terms. So the collective benefit is data ecosystems shall be designed and function in ways that enable Indigenous peoples to derive benefit from the data. Authority to control is Indigenous people's rights and interests in Indigenous data must be recognized, and their authority to control such data be empowered. Responsibility. Those working with Indigenous data have a responsibility to share how those data are used to support Indigenous people's self-determination and collective benefit. And ethics. So Indigenous people's rights and well-being should be the primary concern at all stages of the data life cycle and across the data ecosystem. And we'll go over OCAP. So ownership refers to the relationship of First Nations to their cultural knowledge, data, information. This principle states that a community or group owns information collectively in the same way that an individual owns his or own personal information. Control. This affirms that First Nations and their communities and representative bodies are within the rights to seeking control over all aspects of research and information management processes that impact them. So First Nations control of research can include all stages of a particular research project from start to finish. And access refers to the fact that First Nations must have access to information and the data about themselves and their communities, regardless of where it is held. Okay. And lastly, possession. Well, ownership identifies the relationship between people and their information in principle. Stewardship and possession is more concrete. It refers to the physical control of data. So possession is a mechanism by which ownership can be asserted and protected. Okay, so I know that was a lot, but I'm hoping that this presentation will encourage you to think about RDM as a collection of best practices and concepts that can be applied or not as appropriate to your particular research. Okay. So benefits and advantages of RDM. The first one is that it can support efficiency and organization by standardizing ways data are collected and dealt with. It can be useful to document your practice for your own and for any team members' reference, which can make personnel transitions and training easier on particular projects. It can help you keep track of your files and what you're doing with them over the course of the project. For example, if you're working on a project over a number of years and potentially publishing that project, and you get questions about your project many years down the road, it's very beneficial to have clear documentation to go back to and understand what you had done in the past. Another example is if you're on a research project and you have multiple student assistants, it's just helpful to have that documentation about what needs to be done with the data and by whom. And for graduate students, a data management plan can be a communication tool between you and your supervisor, alongside with your research project proposal. So the proposal and the DMP can act as a foundation with how data will be handled through your research project. Number two, so RDM will support increasing visibility and recognition for your work with data. So you can plan for a data set to be preserved in a repository, and AU does have a repository, which I'll try to go over if we have time, which once you deposit in this repository, you can allow other researchers to cite your data and give you credit for your work. And number 3, RDM supports the contribution to the movement towards open scholarship, because the potential of having that data be reusable increases the trust in research by supporting replicability and transparency of studies. And lastly, RDM best practices will help you comply with any funder, institution, and publisher policies related to data management, data retention, and data sharing. You'll need to be aware of and plan for how you're going to comply with these policies, and we'll go through these in more detail. Okay, so these are the takeaways of some links that you may find beneficial in your research. Let's see. So the AU Library Guide is Research Data Management Guide is gives you an overview of this presentation, and the RDM Professional Development course is free to take, and it might be helpful to take this particular one if you want to have a journal. You can write in your journal thoughts about the data management process as you're going through this particular course. And there's some data management guides provided by Eugene Barsky from UBC that are also a great introduction to research data management. And we went through kind of in a lot of detail the different principles that relate to Indigenous data sovereignty as well. And they're also available in more detail online. Okay. So now we're going to talk about the different institutions, publishers, and funders and associations that formally recognize good research data management and data sharing as a part of research culture. And this means that researchers need to be aware of the recommendations and requirements from these different entities that could apply to your research project. And these requirements could come from your home institution, from research ethic boards, or from a journal that you wish to publish in. So common RDM requirements for data deposit and sharing is to have a data management plan submitted as part of your funding application, but it's not a requirement yet in Canada. And so some questions to think about when you're dealing with data management is, does your funder have any general RDM policies? Does the specific call for funding have any RDM related requirements? And do you have a target venue of publication, and do they require a data deposit? And does your Canadian institution have any policies about handling or retaining research data? And in the Canadian context, we'll go over the tri-agency's RDM policy. So the tri-agency RDM policy was released a few years ago, and there were some requirements that had to be phased in for both the institutions and for researchers. Particularly for institutions, we needed to have an institutional RDM strategy in place by 2023, and we have one for AU. For researchers in particular, data management plans and data deposits may be required. For example, the requirement for data management plans is being piloted on a subset of calls. So this requirement is being phased in, is being piloted in. And the Canadian Institute of Health Research has a requirement that applies to all projects funded from 2008 onwards for certain types of data types. An important thing is that these requirements are phased in for grant funding, not for scholarship funding at this time. So graduate students who hold a research assistant position could work on projects that are subject to the requirements as they phased in. Okay, and forward here. And there's more details, again, in the GitHub link, but due to time, I will just move forward. But there is information about the tri-agency statement on principles on data management, the Canadian Institute of Health Research and Open Access, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, they have a data archiving statement as well. Forward. So the tri-agency policy requirements for researchers. We talked a little bit about data management plans, but we'll go over it in a little bit more detail here. So a data management plan is an actual document that explains the whole life cycle of research data management. So it's about how the data will be collected, documented, formatted, protected, and preserved. So if you're going to reuse existing data, where are you getting that data from? What is it? And is there going to be any new data created over the course of your project? It's also, the DMP also goes over whether and how the data will be shared, where the data will be deposited or retained long-term, and etc. The tri-agency is also encouraging standardized tools such as the DMP Assistant. And yeah, hopefully we can do a demo of that at the end. A data deposit, on the other hand, is a requirement that all data, metadata, and code be placed in a repository for safe storage, curation, and preservation. So that's all the data and metadata and code leading to the publication. And the tri-agency policy is specific to thinking about research outputs at that publication context. And the idea is that access to that data will be provided where ethical, legal, and commercial requirements allow. So if you have a research partner or have human participants who have not consented to sharing their data, you are not expected to share that data in a repository, for example. Okay. Okay, so we talked about funders, right? And now we're moving on to publishers. So many publishers have data sharing policies and may require a data availability statement. They may have this built into their manuscript submission process. So you'll need to check the author guidelines for the specific journal you are submitting to. And so the data availability statement gives information about where you can find that particular data or where the paper can be found and what conditions have to be met in order to be given access to the data. Yeah, and so usually with a data availability statement, there will be a link or a digital object identifier linking to that data set. Okay, so moving forward. So this is an example of a data availability statement. So I'll just go over this one. The data that supports the findings of this study are openly available in the Athabasca University Data Repository Collection in Borealis at this digital object identifier link. Another example, PRO-SEQ data was deposited in the gene expression omnibus data set under this session number and is available at the following URL. Oh, sorry, I moved back to my slide. One important thing I'll point out is that up here, there's a Taylor Francis template, and it requires the data availability in the manuscript before the reference section of your publication. However, this can be adjusted for a double-blind peer review, so some repositories can support creating a private or blind link for peer review purposes. Okay, and then these are some links to the tri-agency documents. I didn't have a chance to go over that, but you do have the links here. Athabasca University does not have institutional policies specific to research data at this point in time, but we are developing guidance for researchers. And the Research Ethics Board also recommends retaining data for a minimum of 5 years, because that is the Canadian Institute Health of Researchers of Research requirement. And there's a list of further templates of data availability statements from these different publishers, so Taylor, Sage, Wiley, Elsevier, etc. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears and talk about what this data management plan looks like in more detail. So as we kind of already discussed a little bit, the data management plan is a document that's going to describe how the data is collected, documented, formatted, protected, and preserved. It talks about how the existing data sets will be used and what new data sets will be created, what new data will be created over the course of the project, and whether the data will be shared and where that data will be deposited. And so this data management plan is a living document, and you can update it as needed as your project evolves. How data management plans will be evaluated in upcoming tri-agency competitions is yet to be fully developed, but it will be based on planning to implement best practices throughout the life cycle. As I mentioned before, for graduate students, you can use this data management plan to plan your research project, and you can use this to communicate with you can use it as a tool to communicate with your supervisor. And then I'm going to go over some general considerations for research data management that would be addressed in your data management plan before we go into how to use the data management plan assistant tool provided by the Alliance. Okay. So all aspects of a data management plan can be dependent on ethics, research partnerships, and legal considerations. So when you're working on a data management plan, there's going to be some ethical, community, or research partner and legal considerations that overarch the entire process because they affect decisions made at all stages of a data management plan. So thinking about things like, do you have human participants or do you require ethics approval? Because a lot of the processes you require have in place as part of your ethics approval would be addressed in your DMP. So you can use one or the other as needed to put more detail in your data management plan. And so you also want to think about the community and industry partners and think about if they have any requirements for data access, handling, or ownership. Do you keep your data when it's done, or do you have an agreement that the data is going back to the community partner? And you may also have a non-disclosure agreement, NDA, around it too. You may want to also think about legal considerations. Are you using an access information request or something else to gain additional access to the data? Have you signed or agreed to specific terms in order to access or collect data? Because all of this needs to be compiled throughout your research project. So ethics and RDM. So if you want to or required to share your data, you should plan this again from the beginning. If you have human participants, they should be notified and consent to data being released. And this is typically done on a consent form when participants consent to participate in your study. How you intend to use the data and whether or not it can be used, reused, or deposited is determined by the language in your information and consent documents. Again, ideally, you should try to make your data as open as possible, but as closed as necessary. Going over the Tri-Council policy statement number 2, which is the ethical conduct of research involving humans. This TCPS2 outlines considerations for ethical conduct of researcher, and it has specific chapters related to privacy, confidentiality, First Nations, Inuit, Métis people, qualitative research, clinical trials, human biological materials, and human genetic research. So ethics, processes, and research data management. So this statement on the ethical conduct of researcher was updated at the end of 2022. Participant data is required. So if participant data is required for data to be used beyond the current project, so your ethics approval, when you apply for it, is typically project-based. But if you're thinking about sharing or reusing that data, you have to plan that early on. And that's part of the update in this TCPS 2 2022. So the TCPS has a section added into it about broad consent for storage of data and human biological materials for future and unspecified research. So there's some particular things you need to think about early on in your ethics application that will be relevant to your research project. And if you have specific questions about the ethics application, you can reach out to me or our new research ethics officer. And then we work closely with people who that are thinking about using data that involves human participants. Okay, so these are some tools and resources related to ethics and sensitive data. And we have a link to the actual full text of the TCP S2. I've also listed Portage's sensitive data tools, and they have a 3-part toolkit set. So this toolkit is produced and it's openly available and adaptable. They have a glossary of terms for sensitive data and a human participant research data risk matrix. So it's intended to think about how sensitive your data, so the matrix has helped you think about how sensitive your data is and what kind of practices you should place on it. So for example, you might be thinking about, is my data storage secure enough if I have sensitive data coming from my participants? They also have a document providing examples of research data management language for informed consent. So things like what conditions that the data, that you can make the data available to other researchers. You can put that information. You also need to have a separate consent statement in most cases for data sharing, so that participants can agree to be in your study and then additionally agree or not agree to have that data shared, say in a data repository. If you do intend to share it in a repository, you can explain what conditions you would be sharing that data under. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about documenting your data and your processes. And again, this was on that data lifecycle diagram that we saw before about documenting your data. So when you plan for how you collect and store and analyze your data, these are some of the questions to consider. A key piece to consider is data security needs, which may be based on the ethics requirements for human participant and other obligations, so such as intellectual property rights and other research agreements. So some projects might have a lab procedural document, and that is another example of documenting your data. And so another thing we want to think about is, do you have a data collection protocol? So for example, if you're doing an interview research, and and you might have created a script to do these interviews, and you may consider also having a file naming convention of how you're saving different versions of your file. You also want to be thinking about how your data can be described and documented. And for some different disciplines, there may be also metadata standards that are used for those particular disciplines. You also want to be thinking about different versions of your files, and are you going to be using a version control tool? And a useful thing to do here is to think about how you save things, and if you were going to, for example, come back to revisit your data set 5 or 10 years down the road, did you have enough documentation with your data to know what you did? Okay, so file naming, which we talked a little bit about, it's important to be very descriptive and consistent when you name your files. So the first step would be developing and recording your conventions for naming your storage, like your directory folders. And these folder structures actually can be outlined in what is called a README file, which we will go over in more detail later on. Robin has created some worksheets to help with creating like a systematic naming convention, and these naming convention and for creating README files, and these are linked in the takeaway handout. So when we're talking about file naming, some general considerations to follow and to think about is, does your project or experiment have a name or acronym that you can put in the file name? Is it location specific? Are there spatial coordinates or location names you want to include for samples in your file names? And are there multiple researchers? Do you want to put the research names or their initials? For example, if they're the ones doing the interviews or collecting a set of data. And do you need a data collection or a data range for the experiment for the type of data you're collecting? And do you need to indicate what type of data it is in your file name? For example, you can say this type of data is a survey. So other conditions to think about is, do you want to keep track of the version number of the file? And some general tips are, which we will go over, is like you can put the version number at the end of the file. It's also, as you're naming your files, it's a good idea to avoid special characters like question marks, asterisks, and punctuations, because not all operating systems will allow these special characters in the file name. It's also a good idea not to put spaces in the file name. It's just a recommendation, but instead of using spaces, you can use underscores or camel case where you capitalize the new words. And it's a recommendation to also put the date format in your file name, which we'll go over, but you put the year, the month, and the day in your file format. Yeah, and so we'll go over one example of a particular file name here. So here we have the date for the audio, and these particular names are flower names for the different interview groups, so lilac, and there's information on what kind of file type it is, so audio, video, transcript. So this is one example of how you could do file naming. You can do it however it fits your research purposes, and as long as you're consistent with it. Okay, so these are some documentation examples. So potentially you need additional documentation, and again, these are very research specific to your discipline. So some common types are data dictionaries, and data dictionaries explain the variables and how they're all coded. You might also have a code book. In a qualitative study, that code book is usually describing what codes you've assigned to a particular topic in your data and how they are assigned by you to do an analysis. But this would be a little bit different if you're doing a quantitative study. You might also have some lab notes and memos, and these can be in print or electronic format. And these can be handwritten or transcribed. You might also have some scripts and codes, and you may have a full-on computing environment, particularly if you're doing modeling of data. And the last one here, a README file, we'll go over an example in the next slide. Okay, so this is a README example. So what I recommend is if you're setting up folders on your computer, is to create a README file at the top of your directory. But if you have a fairly complex set of folders, you may want to have a README file in each of these top level folders that explains how your folders and files are named. So this example came from Kristen Briney. She's in a university in the States, and she put together this README file. So this is a chemistry project, and it shows the dates that the project is running. And she put the name of the organization, and she has the important project top level folders listed here. And then inside it, each of the top level folders, she includes the raw data, analyzed data, paper drafts, and documentation. So she's following a particular file naming standard and noting where these files are stored. So this is a very high level example. Some of these can get much longer. And you can also see this is an example of how she's naming her files here by year, experiment, and experiment number. And she's also including how she's storing the data on her computer and how it's being backed up securely in the organization server. And she has a backup copy. And we'll talk a little bit about storing data and backing up your data as well later on. Okay, so we went quickly through the file naming and documentation of data. So as I mentioned, Robin has created some worksheets on file naming and how to create a README file. And let me see what else we have here. So there's also metadata standards catalog right here. And it depends on your discipline, but like it may or may not be useful to you. There's also README templates here. There's one from different organizations such as Further, Cornell, and one that Robin has put together. So usually these README files, as I mentioned before, these are actually a plain text file, and it's explaining how you're naming your files, where you're storing them, and again, you put them at the top level of your folders. So anyone that's doing like computer sciences or other sciences, you would probably have a complex set of scripts and code and full-on computer environment, and you would use the README file to help like document how you're setting up these computing environments. Yeah, and then this particular guide, the Turing Guide for Reproducible Research, has more details on how to document computational environments and code. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to move on to talking about active data storage. And it's important to think about active because this is the data that you're currently using and processing, analyzing. This is different from a data deposit, which I think we will cover briefly too. So we do get this question a lot, so that's why we put active in square brackets, because a lot of researchers tend to ask, where can I put my data when I'm starting my project? So for example, you've got funding, you've received funding, or you have your supervisor's approval to start. You're going to be wondering, where can I put my data? So a lot of these considerations I'm going to go through are relevant for later in your data lifecycle, as well, because you're not storing data in the same spot while you're actively using the data. So what I mean is how you're actively using the data will not be the same spot as, 10 years later after the project is done. So in order to select appropriate data storage, you're going to think about what systems have appropriate security, and do you need different locations for different versions of your data? And do you have master copies, and are you making working copies off of those master copies? You also want to be thinking about if you have identifiable and de-identified transcripts, and do you need to store those two separately from each other? That's a common question that we get through the ethics application. But you need to have a way to do that in the storage system you're using. You may need to. Do you have a process or processes for transferring your data? So for graduate students, your supervisor may need to be able to access your data. Do you have a way for them to do that? And how is your data backed up and where? We like to emphasize this particular one because not everyone thinks about backups immediately. So if something happens to your data and you lose 2 years of work on your original project, you can't really rebuild that again, so it's a good idea to have a backup system separate from your active storage. And then when thinking about software and platforms that you may be using, these may have different security and processes built into them. Okay, so storage types. These are kind of the more high-level types of storage that we see. Network drives are storage devices, usually large organizations have these. They're also called storage server or network attached storage devices. And in order to access these network drives, you need to have a network connection. And IT would likely help you get set up access for these drives. And you would, backing up, to access these network drives, you likely need to use like what is called a VPN, a virtual proxy network. Cloud storage is a distributed remote storage solution. So you can upload and access your data from anywhere as long as you have an internet connection. So some common types, as many of you already know, are Dropbox, Google Drive, and Microsoft OneDrive. Portable storage media. These can be connected to your computer using like a USB cable. And yeah, DVDs, CDs, USBs, and external hard drives are some common types of portable data that you can connect with your computer and where you can store your data. And your computer's hard drive is another example. If you're using your computer hard drive, it's a good idea to encrypt your computer hard drive and any of these other portable storage media. Storage provider considerations. So you'll need to consider the terms of service for using that product and whether or not they meet your security and confidentiality needs. You have to remember that these cloud services use distributed data centers. And so if those data centers are outside your country of residence, then they're subject to those laws in those jurisdictions. So a couple things to think about is check whether the provider secures the data. Is the data encrypted at rest to protect from hackers and data breaches? And is the data encrypted in transit to protect it from being uploaded or downloaded from the service? So yeah, definitely look at the policies on data use. Some companies use the data you input in their system to improve their products, such as training their algorithms. If you, for example, assured your participants that the data you provide, that data provide you will only be used for research purposes stated in the consent form, you shouldn't be providing it to a company to help improve their commercial product. You should also be discussing data security, encryption, and backup options with IT because they are equipped to speak with the technical aspects. Institutions also negotiate enterprise contracts with these service providers. And so they're generally considered better than using the free cloud service accounts because privacy's impact and the security assessments were done on those services by IT. I think I mentioned at the beginning, but the Digital Research Alliance has some advanced research computing and storage services. Some faculty members at the Canadian universities and some other Canadian institutions can get accounts. As a graduate student, your supervisor would need to sponsor you to get an account. Yeah, and I just wanted to emphasize one more time, like to consult with AUIT if you're part of a research team who has collaborated with another institution. Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate that. And you can, for example, if you to contact IT, you can email them at helpdesk@athabascau.ca, and you can ask for the research tool squad. And then some of the services that the research tool squad gets access to may also require your supervisor to fund or sign off of. So just something to be aware of and talk about as you plan. Okay. And moving on to backups. So having backups of your data helps to protect you from data loss, as we mentioned before. So for example, if there's a power failure, hardware failure, you know, virus, hacking, human error, the backups will hopefully help you in case those events occur. It's also recommended to have a geographically distributed copies of your data as a measure of protection from risk that are geographically bounded. So say if there's an earthquake or something that's you have your data in another location from where you are. A useful general recommendation for backups is the 3-to-1 rule. So this means having 3 copies of your data and in 2 different locations, for example, 1 local and 1 offsite, and then using more than 1 type of storage media. You should also periodically check your backups to ensure you can still access your data. If you're using an automated system, check that it's working properly. If you use computers provided by AU, they do backups. You also may want to check with IT what is being backed up. You want to also ensure that you understand how any cloud service you're using works. Some cloud services may keep distributed copies, but if you delete an item, it may delete all of them. So just something to be careful of. Okay, so some tools and resources, as I mentioned before, you can email AUIT at helpdesk@athabascau.ca and ask for Research Tool Squad. Yeah, and I mentioned before the Digital Research Alliance of Canada has advanced research computing services. But to get access to this, you would need to be sponsored by your supervisor. Yeah, and once your supervisor sponsors you, you can get an alliance, an account. Oh yeah, and another important thing is as you're filling out the ethics application for human participant research, you'll see in the application that they do recommend you to contact AUIT, and that's in tab 5 of the ethics application. Yeah, and just let IT know that you're working on a ethics application, because that helps them kind of know what type of questions you may have. Okay, now we're going to switch gears. We talked about a lot about active storage. Now we're going to talk about long-term storage in the future. So we want to consider what purposes the data is being kept and what kind of value the data has for being kept. Is it for yourself? Is it for others in the field you intend to share that data with? So what value does the data have long term? Can your data be reproduced? Are the observations unrepeatable? How difficult or cost intensive would it be to reproduce? Are there barriers to reusing the data? What will you collect the data under conditions that permit reuse? Is the data independent or specific to software needed to access and interpret it? And will the data be unique? Is your copy the only one? Or is there another copy held by another institution or body? For example, if you're using secondary data analysis, someone else might have that master copy. Okay, next point is what purposes are you keeping the data? So anticipated future use can affect what you keep. So for example, some questions to consider is, do you need to comply with the funder or institution requirement to retain that data for a set time period or to deposit it in a repository? Second, are you planning to publish in a journal that requires you to share that data? Thirdly, is that data do you need to retain that data to verify your results? Next, do you plan to do future analysis? Do you see any value in making the data available to other researchers? And lastly, do you plan to use that data for teaching and learning purposes? I think I mentioned this before, but some funders have retention policies, and keeping a data for a minimum of 5 years is recommended by our ethics board, and this is based on the Canadian Institute Health Research Policy. And another thing to keep in mind is is your data being kept by your supervisor or in the team? Okay, so I'll go to the next slide. Data deposit. So data deposit, I'll go over the definition here. So this definition was pulled out of the tri-agency policy because they use this terminology and it's specific to Canada's context. In the case of US funders, they talk more about data management. And in Canada, we talk more about data management plans and data deposit requirements. So a data deposit is research data that's collected as part of the research project and transferred to a data repository. And that repository should have policies describing how they're preserving and storing and backing up the data and the access controls. So the idea here is, as a researcher, you're actually transferring a data set to a repository for a long-term stewardship. And as part of the repository service, they're ensuring that the data remains accessible and shareable. Not all these repositories guarantee preservation, but they are often used as a access or publishing platform. Okay. And it's not a requirement, but data deposit and sharing does contribute to open scholarship, as we mentioned before. And as we mentioned before as well, not all data may be able to be deposited and made fully accessible. And so when we're talking about different repositories, there's three main types: disciplinary repositories, institutional repositories, and generalists. Disciplinary repositories are pretty good because other people that are in your field will more likely find it. At AU, we have an institutional repository that you can use. Generally, it's also considered a generalist repository because we accept multiple disciplines, not just one. A generous repository is non-discipline specific. So the one that's offered by Canada nationwide is the Federated Research Data Repository. And as a researcher, you get 1 terabyte of data. Oh, I'm jumping the gun here. Okay, so when you're selecting a repository for your data set, these are some things to consider. What kind of repository should I deposit my data in? Does it fit your project and discipline? Does it provide curation? So curation is about how curators can work with you to make your data more fair. And so looking at the metadata for your data set and helping it be more findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Does the repository provision persistent identifiers? So if you have to put a data availability statement, you can put that DOI in that statement. Some repositories, but not all of them, have long-term preservation as their commitment. For example, some will keep the data set for 10 years or more. So certification is a standard is a standard by the Core Trust Seal. And again, not all Canadian repositories have this certification. But some are not all of them are seeking that particular certification. Okay, so of the DOP assistant tool. So really quickly, this is the home page to sign in. Don't use the sign in with the institutional one. You'll just create it. You'll just use this one here to create your account. And I'll just sign in. So on my dashboard, I have a couple of plans I created, and these are mock data management plans. And when you sign up using your Athabasca University email, you'll get slotted inside the Athabasca University AU's instance of it. So Robin has put together some useful links to go to the library, to go to the RDM guide, and to email us if you need to. Yeah, I'll just go through this test one. So it's pretty straightforward, I think, to use this tool. It's basically filling in the blanks of your research project, the dates of when you're doing your project, and then make sure to click save, because I don't think it automatically saves. And one thing I kind of jumped the gun here is when you create a plan, you'll get access to different, just put here. Make one actually right now. Okay, so when you create a new plan, you're going to title your project and you're going to enter the organization name. And then you'll have access to different types of templates. The one I like to use is the simplified template one. And you'd create a plan. And you can add contributors that are part of your plan. And this is kind of like the more meat and potatoes part of it, where you're writing your plan. And there's the simplified plan has 5 overarching questions, and they have guidance as well here. And when you share this plan with other collaborators, they can add comments to each of your plans boxes. So yeah, I'll show the sharing function here really quickly. So yeah, you can add an email and share it with another collaborator. And as I mentioned before, if you use your AU email, you get access to like these links, but you also get access to this request feedback button. And once you're done your plan, you can click this button and we can take a look at your plan. And there's a download button here as well if you prefer to have a copy outside of this platform. You can download it as a CSV file, but you can also download it as a text as well. Okay. I had more slides, but I think I'm out of time, but they are available through the GitHub page. So I'll stop sharing right now. Okay, thank you so much, everyone.